Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Silence of Savoir. We have a very interesting guest today, Professor Venable, Professor Hannelin Venable from the University of Mary. Professor Venable has a very interesting academic background. She completed her BA in philosophy and music from the University of Texas, and Professor Venable received her PhD from the University of Dallas in philosophy. Uh, Dr. Venable's expertise includes history of philosophy, continental philosophy, phenomenology, postmodernism, French philosophy, aesthetics, ethics, philosophy of psychology, and philosophical theology. Today we're going to talk about Professor Venable's recent publication, her book on Foucault and Merleau-Ponty. The book is called Madness and Experience in History, Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology and Foucault's Archaeology. Professor Venable, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. I'm very excited. As a Foucault scholar, I'm very excited about discussing this book with you. Um, so I guess we can just jump in and start with the first question. So what is this? What is the book about, and what is the purpose of this book, and who is it intended for?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again so much for having me here. I've been really excited about this. We've been emailing for a few months trying to get a date, so it's great to be here. And yeah, so thank you, Georgi, and thank you for having me and being interested in my book. That's just exciting, just all on its own. When you write a book, you think, is anyone going to read this? Is anyone going to be interested? So it's wonderful to start hearing feedback from people, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But so my primary passion, I think, behind this book is really wanting to show dignity and value in human experiences that are often overlooked, often dismissed, often dehumanized. And that was sort of my sort of really big picture, my big motivation when I thought about writing this book. And I thought, one of the places that we often sort of dismiss, think of as sort of not fully human, are in areas such as mental illness. We think, well, maybe we don't even think it consciously, but we sort of think, well, they're a little, not as human, or they're not able to live a full human life. So I'm really wanting to push back against that, and that's sort of the motivation of thinking about just a greater understanding of diverse human experiences, including experiences of mental illness, and finding value and dignity in those experiences, and then ultimately in humans themselves. So that's sort of what got me started thinking about it. And then some other particular goals with the book is trying to offer an original approach to mental health by bringing together both kind of the individual experience side, but also this historical side. And that really hasn't been done together. There's definitely things thinking about, okay, how do we think about this in terms of someone's individual experience, kind of the phenomenological thing, and then also sort of historical. There's been some attempts, not as much, to sort of think about it in those terms. And so I think I really try to argue, at least in my book, that these things brought together are really helpful. So that's sort of an original approach, perspective to add, not the only perspective, but a perspective to add to thinking about mental health. And then another thing that I'm trying to do is sort of a philosophical thing, which is bringing together Merleau-Ponty and Foucault, which is also a challenge, not always done, especially in the English-speaking world. And so trying to offer a synthesis for sort of their philosophies being put together. And then, as you mentioned, hopefully we'll get to later in the interview, just practical help for people who work in mental health. Again, not the only perspective, but, here's some other ways of thinking about it. When you're feeling frustrated with the medical model, you're feeling like this isn't helping fully, helping some, but not fully. What are other things that I can think about, other ways to make sense of these experiences that seem like they don't make sense? So that's sort of another goal, is just offering really practical help for those who work in mental health. Yeah, so those are kind of, those four things have been what I started when I started writing the book and tried to accomplish in the book itself. And I did that. The structure of the book kind of comes out where, like, the first chapter is trying to give, like, the whole thing, like, okay, here's the unity, here's how we think about experience and history together, here's how that would, some practical things that it might play out, just to kind of give someone a taste, or like, okay, I kind of see where she's going, this sounds interesting. Now let me kind of find the ground for it. So after that first chapter, then I go into the phenomenological look, looking at Merleau-Ponty. So I look kind of his general method, and then particularly in regard to madness or mental illness. And then my next two chapters are looking at Foucault, again, kind of general approach in terms of his history of madness, and then more particular how he thinks about madness in relation to psychology. And then the last two not the last two. The next two chapters are then kind of problems with bringing together these two thinkers and these two approaches, and then trying to synthesize those. And the final chapter is really where I finally get to more specific practical implications, applications for those working in mental health. So that's kind of how I tried to accomplish the goals in the book. Surprisingly, I don't use the terms like human dignity and human value that much in the book, even though that was kind of my motivation. But I'm more wanting to sort of lay the groundwork, and you'll see that in like my conclusion. Like, I'm gesturing towards these ideas, and I think it's underlying there, but it's not like an argument on every page. It's just sort of, let's explore this area of human experience, ultimately to show something like value in diverse human experiences.
Okay, wonderful.
So yeah, is that kind of helpful in terms
Absolutely,
of
yeah.
a sketch? Okay, great. So.
Wonderful, because historically we know that Merleau-Ponty did influence Foucault a lot, right? At the lectures
That's
at
right.
the Collège de France.
That's right.
And so, but then Foucault sort of distanced himself from phenomenology, at least as it is classically conceived.
That's right.
So before we jump to that questions with the question that addresses the problems of the reconciliation,
Sure.
I was hoping maybe we could talk a little bit about Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach to mental illness and your notion or his notion of the prerational, and what role that has to play within the overall structure of the book.
Right. Yeah, so the pre-rational, sometimes he calls it the pre-objective or the primordial. Those are all words that he uses to try to make sense of the way that we kind of grasp the world before we realize that we've grasped the world. So pre-reflective, that's another one that he used. Unreflected is another one. So all those terms to kind of think of like, how is it that we already somehow have a sense, and that French, that sens, that meaning of the world, and that sens is, both meaning and direction. So it's interesting because it's meaning, but in French, it also means like directed towards something. So somehow, before we even realize it, when we experience something, we have a sense of a meaning for it. And it's not just kind of floating meaning. It's actually like towards some type of goal, right? And then we can reflect on it and be like, oh yeah, okay, I really loved that painting that I glanced at because I, like the colors that are displayed on it, and I like the dark first light or something like that, right? So then we can put words on it, but sort of that initial experience is just like, oh, I like that. I enjoy that. So the pre-rational then is something that we all have just by being human, and we search for meaning in the world before we even realize that that's what we're searching for, because we already have this bent towards meaning. He actually uses the word condemned to meaning, but he doesn't mean condemned in like a punishment negative sense. It's just that we can't do anything but find meaning in the world. And so my point in bringing it up in terms of mental health is that, look, human behavior at its core isn't this perfectly rational way of experiencing the world. We're already taking in the world before we're even making sense of it rationally. So if we're going to say something like, oh, those people who have mental illness, they're not rational, they're irrational. That's actually not a correct statement, because human behavior at its core has this relationship already there between kind of the rational and what I call the non-rational. And that's already present. So the distinction between, and we still need distinctions, and I try to, it's a hard tension, but I try to keep that tension in my book of like, it's not then to say, there's no distinctions, like there's no such thing as mental illness. Like that's not what I want to say either. So distinctions can be still helpful. Diagnosis can still be helpful. But we do the diagnosis not because, okay, those people aren't rational and we are rational. But actually, no, these people are operating from the same kind of structures, this sort of non-rational, rational structure. They're operating from that, but it might be a little broken. It might be a little distorted in a certain way that doesn't make it play out quite right. But it's not some other structure that we don't understand. It's the same human structures that we're all using to engage the world. So an example that I use in my book is the idea of being homesick, and how when we are homesick, it's sort of not very rational, because we don't really feel in the place that we're in. We're really longing to be in some other place, right? And so in some sense, it's not completely rational, because you should know you're in this place, you're not in that place, and yet you kind of feel like your heart's back wherever you want to be, right? And so in experiences of hallucination, which is sort of much more extreme sense of this, it's actually a similar thing. You feel like you're in a space that isn't sort of objectively the exact space. So then we can kind of understand what's going on there, even though, yes, there's sort of a more extreme thing with hallucination. But that approach to space, which is kind of non-objective, that subjective approach to space, is just the way humans experience space. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the pre-rational with Merleau-Ponty, and connecting that to sort of common human experiences, both in mental disorders and not in mental disorder.
Right. That was very that was fascinating for me, because it really it did that flip when you think one way and now you're thinking in a different way. Because I used to, well, a lot of people think that, okay, there's a problem. This person is being irrational. We say this very often, right?
Right.
The person's being irrational.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
but the picture you paint, it makes it look, and I think that's exactly the way it is that it's not that someone is irrational, but the way they use their irrational is different from the way we
Right.
use our irrational. Maybe not the most elegant way of
Exactly.
saying it, but it's
That's
it's an
right. Yeah.
exercise of the irrational that seems to be at a
Yeah.
divide. Okay.
That's right. Yeah. And like they can't quite regulate their non-rational with the rational, and maybe in the same way. There's still that relationship there. It's not totally severed, but you can't, like you said, you can't quite use it in the same way,
Hmm.
right? There's a little bit of disconnect there.
Okay. Perfect. And so now you mentioned the non-rational, right? Now we have three terms here, right? We have the non-rational, we have the pre-rational, we have the irrational. And
That's right. Yeah.
irrational is something you've associated more with Foucault's work, and the non-rational
Right.
is like an umbrella term that contains both,
That's right.
right? So maybe we could talk about
That's
that
right. Yeah.
distinction a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. That distinctions actually came out of a conversation that I had with Emmanuel Faulk, who's a French philosopher in the Institut Catholique de Paris, and I was trying to wrestle through. Okay, all of these things sort of seem to be um, have a lack of reason, but a lack of reason in different ways. And I was trying to figure out how to make sense of that. And as we talked through, we kind of came up with this way of thinking of like, and you could use different terms, but the way that I think of it is, yeah, the non-rational sort of this umbrella term, anything that kind of lacks reason to a certain, never completely, but well, I'll say one thing that might be complete, but sort of lacks rational. And then there's actually sort of four ways of thinking about that. So there's the two that I talk about in my book, which is the pre-rational, something that's prior to the rational. Something like when we do habits, or when we immediately have a sense, I like that painting, I don't like it, or, there's a bunch of people in this room and you haven't counted the people, but you just have a sense there's a bunch of people in the room. So those sort of pre-rational things. Irrational tends to be more against the rational, right? Something that's like, this is the reason, talking to somebody that's not there seems to be irrational, because like there is not someone actually there, but you're talking to someone, right? Sort of against reason. And then the other two that I don't talk about in my book would be the supra-rational. And this is something like, perhaps going beyond reason, maybe experiences of faith could be something like this. And the fourth one that Emmanuel Faulk has talked about that I haven't yet, but is the unrational. And this is something he's thinking like brute nature, like a rock or something like that. And that's where it's like, maybe that's like a complete lack of rational. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that one. Maybe I will someday, but that would be interesting. But yes, for my book, it's the pre-rational and the irrational. They're both sort of have a lack of rational, but kind of come out in different ways. And both, I want to reiterate, it's never that in experiences that we might call irrational, that the rational is completely gone. So even an example of this person talking to someone who's not there, right? We think, well, that's really irrational behavior. And there's a sense that that's true, but there's still a reason why that person's talking. He's talking because he sees a person that's there. So there's still a reason that sort of makes sense, even if sort of objectively speaking, that person isn't actually there, right? So even embedded in the irrational, there's kind of a reason to a certain extent for why that person's doing that. Yeah. So, and I think, that relationship between the pre-rational and the irrational, between the rational and the non-rational that you see in experience, I think Foucault shows in history. He's saying, look, these things are always feeding each other. They're always using the rational to try to make sense. And for him, it's the déraison, right? It's the unreason. So the people are always using reason to make sense of unreason, and the unreason is somehow then telling us about what reason is, and this relationship that goes back and forth, that is somehow they're always connected throughout the ages, even if they come up with different things. There's some kind of relationship that's there even in history, which is so interesting to match then that experience relationship in history with the experience of the person as well. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And Foucault does also talk about the logic of the irrational very often. He shows the underlying structure as though it's almost as though madness has a syntax, it just doesn't have our semantics,
that's right.
something like this.
That's right.
And you do mention this in your book that, for instance, a melancholic consciousness or what we would call a schizophrenic structure of fantasy, it always draws on reality. It's never completely separate from reality, right? So
that's right.
The mad or the mentally ill, they always take something from the objective world to sustain their fantasy, right? Maybe we could talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. That's one of my favorite quotes from Merlo Panti, where he says that someone who's struggling with, he's melancholy, but we think today of sort of major depressive disorder, like borrows structures of the world in order to negate them. And but it's taking things that are already there, that we already have this givenness of the world that's there, but then we kind of twist them. And like an example I think I talk about is like birth and death. Like there's sort of this cycle that we see in life of birth and death, but sometimes when you're struggling with depression, right, you're sort of just focused on the death aspect of it. So there's a certain sense in which the structure of the world, I mean, there is a sense of like humans are mortal, like humans will die, but you're taking that structure and then you're narrowing in maybe on one aspect of it and twisting it a little bit. So yeah, I think that seems right.
This also reminds me of one of the examples that Foucault cites of how they cured or helped, like one of those unique, interesting cases that Foucault often scrutinizes, where there was a person who thought he was dead and he thought he was a ghost, and then as a treatment, everybody pretended that they were ghosts in order to get him to eat, actually, in order to get him to eat, because he wasn't eating because he was dead. And so they all pretended they were ghosts, and they all sat at a table and started eating to show him that ghosts eat as well. And so and they got him to eat that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's
so interesting.
It's an example of borrowing on those structures.
Understanding the structure, entering that structure of what they're doing, and then kind of helping them in some ways lead them out, maybe not completely, but a little bit. Yeah, that's great.
Now you've discussed several periods, as Foucault does, right? He has a mode of reason, a regime of truth for every epistemic formation. And so maybe we could talk about the differences between how unreason was managed in the Renaissance, in the classical age, and then finally how it's being managed today.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the really, I think, fascinating parts of Foucault's book that you sort of get sucked into when you read it. And even when there's some criticism, like, is all of historical facts that he has in here perfectly right? And, there may be some that aren't, but his telling of this sort of narrative of the history is so compelling when you read it. And I think that sort of that idea of dealing with the déraison, the unreason, is really interesting. But yeah, so Renaissance is this a recognition that people who have some type of madness, and he uses the term madness, and I use that as my title in my book, just sort of a colloquial term. We wouldn't use that now, but this sort of la folie is the French, right? The madness, as representing the unreason, and it's actually a helpful reminder of something that's real. So the unreason that's shown in displays of madness is like, there is darkness in the world. There is tragedy. There is things that don't make sense. And so when people saw the displays of madness in the Renaissance, they were sort of sobered to remind themselves, oh yeah, this is real. These people are reminding us of the darkness and the tragedy that's represented in our world. In the classical age, there begins to be sort of a hiding away of that. And well, since we want to focus on reason and what's rational, let's put away any of those traces of the unreason. Let's lock the people up. So this during the Great Confinement that Foucault sort of famously talks about, right? In Paris, for example, like, a large percentage of the population ends up getting locked up, and because it was like, let's sort of purify ourselves. And there's also that connection between unreason and immorality, right? So there's something evil about unreason, and so let's get rid of it. Let's lock these people up, and so there was still unreason was still there, but we were trying to get rid of it, right? And then in the process of locking up these people, then came sort of the reformers, like you mentioned earlier, right? Of, well, maybe we can fix these people, right? Maybe we can go in and we can bring them back to reason. And some of those things were good because there was an increase in like humane treatment of people that started happening, and this was sort of good. But that leads us then to the modern age, which Foucault would say up to sort of the present time, where we've forgotten all about unreason, because now we just see sort of these people they have sickness that we need to fix, and let's just see how much we can do to sort of help them and fix them. And so in the process, we don't remember anything about this unreason that's connected to sort of these darker, broken elements of the world. But Foucault then says they still pop up. They still come out in these particularly works of art and these other places. The Carnival of the Mad that he attended, I think, influenced him a lot with this, where he saw this. Kind of like a parade that happened outside of a mental institution that he worked at, and it was people that dressed up in costumes from the asylum and from the village as well. They had all these crazy costumes, and you can see pictures of it. And I think that influenced him to see, look, these people who are thinking we have sort of the complete medical understanding of mental illness are still showing these displays of sort of the bizarre and the strange and the tragic in the way that they're dealing with their madness. And that, I think, influenced him a lot to see, okay, it's still there. We just don't want to talk about it very much. So.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned the tragic, right? And the
Yeah.
importance. I think this is something that goes beyond just the Renaissance, right? Because the Renaissance, at least in your book, because in the Renaissance they were very good at recognizing the element of tragic in both madness and as an inseparable part of human experience. Now there seems to be in your book an injunction almost to say that it's very important to not try to hide away the tragic element of human experience and recognize this. And this would be another approach, another way that we could identify better with those that we label as mentally ill and so forth.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think that's mostly coming from Foucault, not so much Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty tends to be more idealistic in the way that he talks, looking at things that appear abnormal to understand the common structures of the human, which is great, but then sometimes doesn't quite give the weight to the suffering that somebody might be experiencing. And so I think Foucault helps us with that. And it's not though, and I want to be careful here because I've been starting to work some in the area of disability studies, and it's not to say something like, people who have mental disorder or who have disabilities, like, oh, some kind of pity or let's just equate their experiences with suffering. And I certainly don't want to say that, but more that, again, there is elements of something tragic in our human experience, all of our human experience. And so some experiences of mental disorder, I'll say some, I won't say all, some experiences of mental disorder remind us of that. And there's other reminders too. I mean, losing a loved one to death, that's another way of sort of like, whoa, this doesn't seem right. These things, this isn't the way I want things to be. So there's definitely other tragic things that kind of shock us out of our comfortable world. But I think experiences of mental illness can be another way of pointing to that. And we, in our sort of medicalized culture, we want to ignore that. We want to fix everything. Any kind of suffering is automatically bad. Get rid of it, instead of realizing, hey, this is sort of a natural part of human life.
Exactly. Perfect. Right. So there's an element of courage that perhaps that needs to be emphasized when we are considering our relationship, those of the so-called healthy ones, with those who suffer from mental illness. And that's very interesting because sometimes we might find out that we are stigmatizing somebody out of our own fear because of the truth that their experience holds, right? And we want to keep it away from us. So that's definitely
That's really
very
well said.
interesting. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. What did you have something in mind when you used the word courage? Because I hadn't thought of it in that connection, but I really like that term, that virtue.
Well, it just came out of reading Foucault, because with Foucault,
Yeah.
the courage of parese, of truth, of frankful speech.
The truth telling, yeah.
Because that the act of truth telling doesn't have to be explicitly political. It can also
Right.
be as a mediating element between everyday human interactions, right? And so
Yeah.
through that, I guess I made the connection there.
Yeah. I really like that. It reminds me of something that I just was reading. I'm, again, kind of my next area of work is possibly in disability studies. And I was just reading someone who said one of the reasons that we feel uncomfortable around people who maybe have disabilities, disorders, is exactly what you said. Well, because we're uncomfortable with something in ourselves, right? Like we don't have the courage to face things that aren't quite right in ourselves. And so when we see someone that we think, oh, something's not quite right, it's actually a problem that we have with even having courage, like you said, to face things that are in ourselves. And yeah, so I think that's really good. And I like that idea of courage. That's great.
Perfect. So moving on to possible problems of reconciliation.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe if you'd like, maybe you could expand a little bit on how precisely the reconciliation happens and what the
Sure.
problems are. But I also want to discuss how Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology is different from maybe classical phenomenology, because it's an
Sure.
embodied
Yeah,
phenomenology, and that's an important
sure.
distinction there. And then maybe we can move on to Foucault's subject or non-subject, and the body as experienced from the inside, which seems to
Sure.
not exist with Foucault. So,
Right. Yeah, yeah. Good. And you had mentioned talking about the acceptance of the book. Is that a little bit later that we're going to talk about that? Or when were you thinking of that?
well, we ended up talking about psychology and mental illness throughout the discussion. Um,
Okay.
so I guess we can talk about that more explicitly towards the end as well, or right now
Sure.
if you.
I just wanted to make
Mhm.
sure I didn't miss something.
No, no.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So remind me your question now is looking at,
Right, phenomenology as we see it with Husserl, the founding fathers of the
Yeah,
school, and with Merleau-Ponty's sort of embodied version.
right. Okay, right. Yes, definitely. So, um, interestingly, I came to phenomenology kind of through Merleau-Ponty. So, for me, his understanding of phenomenology is like, this is
Mm-hmm.
phenomenology. And since then, I've
Mm-hmm.
gone back and read. I knew some Heidegger, I'll say as well, but not really Husserl that well. And so I've gone back now and read Husserl, and it's been really interesting doing it sort of in this backwards way. Um, but one of the things with, I mean, Husserl is certainly getting things started in the right direction, and Merleau-Ponty would certainly acknowledge that he's building. He quotes Husserl in phenomenology perception often. He's building on what Husserl's doing. Um, but to put it very simply, when Husserl wants what he calls a pure phenomenology, he thinks that he can put aside sort of the assumptions of the subject and then really get at this sort of pure scientific approach to human experience. And and he wasn't ever able to quite do that. And what later phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty will say is like, that's exactly the point, right? That the fact that we can never put aside our our subjectivity completely actually tells us about what it is to be human. Because the fact that we're sort of always in our body, always present, even if I'm Descartes sitting in my chair by my fire with the wax melting, thinking maybe I don't have a body, I'm still in my body, right? I'm still there in my body, by the fire. And so we have this amazing human ability of distancing. I mean, Descartes could imagine it. I mean, we have this ability of the human to distance ourselves and look at ourselves as objects and abstract ourselves to a certain extent, but we can't ever do it fully because we're always sort of in a body, and not just in a body, but in a world. And that's where, you have Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty that are really focusing on sort of the being in the world, the givenness of the world. Merleau-Ponty says the logic of the world that my body is part of, So I think it's building on Husserl, but even in maybe the quote unquote, you know, inadequacy of what Husserl did actually points to something really helpful, even if Husserl didn't quite see that. And he did kind of. His later Husserl will start acknowledging things more like intersubjectivity and experiences of the body. Like there is some of that's there. So I think later phenomenology, in particular Merleau-Ponty, right, is then really acknowledging, yes, bodily experience, intersubjectivity, so our sort of dependence and our shaping of ourselves by others. And I'll argue this will kind of lead us into Foucault. We're historically contextualized. And this is something that Merleau-Ponty in particular really highlights. And I have no doubt that Foucault heard that in the lectures and was like, that's right. We have to contextualize humans historically. And Merleau-Ponty didn't develop that completely. He did it some, but not completely. And I think that opening right there that Merleau-Ponty has, leaves the door for Foucault then to sort of grab hold of that and explore that further.
Okay, perfect. So, right, because I remember there was this commonality which you mentioned as making things contextual, and it's kind of a buzzword in academia, right? Situated, right? Situated
Yeah,
discourses.
yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
talks about
Yes,
situated discourses, but
right.
it is interesting to see how Merleau-Ponty's subject is situated in immediate experiences, and the Foucauldian subject is situated within a historical context. And so this was, if I understood correctly, one of the points of reconciliation, right? This is how they
Mm-hmm,
complement each other.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Merleau-Ponty says even in phenomenology perception, man is a historical being. So he just says even there, like we understand. I mean, you can start thinking of Foucault's like that the that ending to the order of things where he talks about sort of the man being written on the sand of the sea and that will soon be washed away. I mean, it's not quite there, but it's a similar kind of idea of like the way that we think about the human is something historically situated, to use the, to use the buzzword. And Foucault takes that even further to say, like, yeah, and it's going to change, and we might think human is this, and it might be erased, and then we think human is this later. So I definitely think there's a point of reconciliation, and even a sense of carrying on, and even those who are going to be resistant to me putting Merleau-Ponty and Foucault in dialogue. And I'm thinking particularly of Hubert Dreyfus and Paul Rubino and their sort of classic book of what is it called, Beyond Hermeneutics and Structuralism. Do you know that book? And yeah, so it's great, super helpful. It's got some interviews. It's got an afterword by Foucault, and in there the way of reading Foucault is going to be different than the way that I read Foucault. But the thing they say in there is that the spirit of what Merleau-Ponty is doing is in Foucault. And so even though they may have a different interpretation, I think they're recognizing this spirit that Merleau-Ponty is talking about in terms of like this sort of the structures of history that shape us, is then carried on with Foucault. So I that's how I see it.
Perfect. Yes, I am familiar with the book, and it's definitely a sort of monumental treatise on Foucault.
Definitely.
But it has received a considerable amount of criticism in terms of turning Foucault into an anthropologist, which I think was Rabinow's influence. But yes, since we're talking about reconciliation, I want to get maybe a little technical, and maybe we could discuss the notion of the flesh, right? Because that seems to be where at least one of the significant points where they meet, right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I didn't talk about flesh too much in my book, just because for both of them, the term flesh doesn't really come up until later in their philosophy. So both Merleau-Ponty's idea of flesh doesn't come up until later, the visible and the invisible, and then Foucault as well, his idea of flesh comes up more in his later works. But I do think that terminology is helpful. And there's actually been a couple of other scholars that have talked about this connection between flesh from Merleau-Ponty and Foucault. But yeah, so for Merleau-Ponty, flesh for him is in invisible. He calls it the double belongingness to the subject and object. And this idea of, flesh is the unity of the human experience. We can't be subject completely. We can't be object completely. We're sort of together, united, subject in flesh. But what's interesting is that idea of flesh, and this is where it's not completely fleshed out, to use the pun. It's not completely worked out, but he talks about it in terms of the flesh of the world. So it's not just flesh as calling human flesh, but there's something about, yes, there's a human flesh, but we are always in relation in the flesh of the world. And so there's a little of ambiguity there, which he's probably fine with, and I don't have it completely worked out myself. But what I do find interesting is that it does relate to Foucault, because Foucault's idea of flesh is, of course, wanting to go beyond one particular human subject as well. And so for Merleau-Ponty, he's recognizing the flesh of the world, which includes, and he's not saying it's like one mind or something like that. It's not saying that, but something about how we are embedded in the world that's been given to us. And Foucault, his idea of flesh, I think, is similar in that he's looking at structures of society that shape the flesh of humans. So I'm thinking particularly of his fourth volume of the History of Sexuality, The Confessions of the Flesh. Have you read it by chance? Because it just sort of came out recently.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So it's an interesting. We should have a side conversation, because I'd love to hear your thoughts about that book just in general, because it's just unique and sort of sort of odd book that he's doing there. Not his usual provocative style. But what I see him doing in that book is that he's looking at these techniques that were done in the early Christian world, such as the practice of confession, particularly in regard to sexuality, as ways of creating the self. And so he's looking at these, and again, he's very nuanced. He's very charitable. He's not just saying, look at these terrible ways of them sort of like, denying sex to these people, but actually like, no, actually there was a more sort of nuanced way of thinking about this. And there actually was some healthy ways of understanding the self here. It's really quite surprising. And one scholar, Foucault scholar, I don't know if you know him, but he's Jean Chevalier. He's a French. Is it Jean? Philippe Chevalier. Philippe Chevalier, I think is his name. He wrote Foucault and le Christianism. Yeah, Foucault and Christianity. It hasn't been translated into English, but he's also done some recent work on the foundation of that fourth volume. And one of the things that he argues, and I heard him give a talk on this, I don't know if he's published it yet, but he argues that Foucault now sees flesh as an experience, not a technique, ultimately, in his fourth volume. That's what he argues. And I could see maybe some people wouldn't agree with that, but he cites the text and he shows the sources there. He did a lot of the work. He was part of the group that kind of gave us the edited volume. And he says that it was, his point was that in the end, Foucault is thinking about experience over power. That's where he ends. And so that idea of flesh is pointing to what kind of experiences can we make sense of for the flesh of humans. So is that kind of helpful in what you
Absolutely,
in where you're wanting to go with that? Okay, good. I mean, there's of course way more we could say, but I think there's some points of similarity there between them.
Definitely. Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought in the question of experience, because that actually sort of takes Foucault full circle into his pre-archaeological period, where he was in the very, very beginning, he was concerned with the question of experience.
That's right. Yeah. And he has these statements in his later interviews that kind of seem like he is saying, no, that's always been what I've been concerned about. Even though you think, but you've been talking about power and techniques and I was just looking at a few of them before our thing. There's one where he says, it's in the afterword to that book by Rubino and Dreyfus, where he says, my whole goal of my work is about the subject. And it's like, but I thought we forgot about the subject. It's like, that's the whole point of all my stuff is the subject, and then there's this other quote. I think it's my favorite Foucault quote, and it's in his lectures that he did called The Technology of the Self. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're not super well known. Okay, do you know them? Yeah. So he has a lot of similar things in the hermeneutics of the subject. There's a lot of similarities, but there's these technologies of the self that he did at, I think it was the University of Vermont or something. Maybe you remember more clearly. I think, is that right?
It is.
Yeah. And he says there that everything that he always loves to make these statements, like all my work is, and everything that I've done is all about the freedom of the subject.
Yeah.
And you think, look, I'm telling you these structures of history, not to show you that you're determined and you're in this hamster's wheel running and running and running, but because you can be free of them. Like, that's the whole point. And I love that. Like, I love that quote. And I just think, for me at least, that makes a lot of sense, what he's up to. He's not talking about the freedom of the subject. He's not talking about the subject. He's talking about these structures so that we can be aware of them and be free if we want to. So those sorts of things make me lean towards this like emphasis on experience at the end of his work as well.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, definitely. A lot. You've touched on a lot of things that I find very interesting. To go back to what you said about the confessions of the flesh, right? I think one of the reasons he's being so charitable or generous with Christianity is I think first of all, it's just the depth and the sophistication of the analysis, right? And of the structures that he's criticizing.
Definitely. I mean, it's so impressive. So impressive.
And the second thing I think is the political dimension of that discourse, because I think he wants to show similarities between that and what's happening today.
Mm-hmm.
Because today power
Mm-hmm.
operates through almost completely benign structures, at least in the West,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's mostly like health, self-care, all these positive,
Mm-hmm.
productive mechanisms that produce subjects, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, because a lot of his work was like, okay, we got it, there's repression, we understand that,
Yeah.
but look
Yeah.
at all these productive mechanisms that we've overlooked. Look at all these
Mm-hmm.
ways that
Yeah.
power can be productive. And so I think this positivity, I think it's a kind of a trap.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a trap because he's going to show,
Interesting.
I think he's going to, what
Yeah.
he shows is that even though it sounds so good, it's still a power
Right.
structure, or precisely because of that,
Yeah.
it's a more powerful power structure.
Right. That's super interesting. Have you written on that yet? Have you written
Um,
anything about that?
not yet. I just have my
Because that
notes.
would be fascinating. I mean, that would be fascinating because something that I read with Stuart Eldon,
Hmm.
his book review of it, he said to make sense of this book, you have to read it with another work of Foucault. And I think he's right. Like, just on its own, you wouldn't, if you took Foucault off the cover and you gave it to someone, they wouldn't know it was written by
Right.
Foucault.
Right.
So I like what you're doing there, where you're saying, well, let's use his idea of sort of these benign structures that are still power structures, but we don't realize that they're there. And maybe that was present in this sort of time period. That would be a fascinating
Hmm.
thesis. So
Okay, wonderful.
yeah.
I will definitely look into that.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we can, because you said you had a presentation of this book in Boston at a conference,
Yes.
right?
Yes, part of it.
Mhm. So I'm very interested in how that went and if there were any psychologists
Yeah.
present.
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah, so yeah, one of the reasons I asked to delay the interview was a little bit because I was about to go to this conference in Boston. It's called Psychology and the Other Conference, and it's actually the book series Psychology and the Other is how my book was published through Routledge. So Psychology and the Other book series is my book is part of that book series published through Routledge. And so this was the first time that my book was available at the conference. And so they had a table with the books in the book series and my book was out, which was like, super exciting. And I gave a presentation I actually did it on the last chapter of my book, which is the chapter where I talk about those three mental disorders, kind of practical implications.
Hmm.
And if we were to take, and I took major depressive disorder, bipolar 1, and schizophrenia, and looked at how might thinking about these things in terms of experience and history help us in thinking about these disorders. So that's what I presented at the conference. And the conference it's a really unique conference because you've got academics there, people in the humanities, philosophy, theology, history, English. But I would say the majority, maybe like 60%, I don't know the exact numbers, are people who work in areas of psychology. So you have psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, lots of different people that work in the area of mental health. And so I was really wanting to see, is this helpful to people who are kind of in the thick of things? I do philosophy. I have friends that deal with stuff, but I'm not counseling people every day in these kinds of things. Is this kind of thing helpful? And I got some really good feedback from people there who said that this is something that's helpful. This is helpful perspectives. I was thinking of one person in particular who came to my talk, who is a psychologist, and we were talking about the idea that Foucault says it's this last line in Foucault's essay on. What is the title of it? I think I wrote it down. It's the Recherche Scientifique et la Psychologie, and it's not translated in English yet, but it's theoretical science. I got it right here. Scientific research in psychology. There we go. But the last line in there is this famous line where he says that psychology can only be saved by return to hell. And it's this, his sort of, he loves to sort of drop these bombs, and that was really helpful when I was talking with this psychologist. That was really helpful for him because, again, he's thinking like, where's psychology coming from? And I'm trying to help these people with these tools, but where's the history of this? Where's this coming from? And it doesn't seem like it's the answer. It might be part of the answer, but it doesn't seem like it's the full answer. And that was actually, he also gave a talk at the conference, and that was one of his title was like, this isn't the, psychology isn't the full answer. So anyway, that was helpful for him to say, look, now I understand a little more why it's not the full answer, because we don't understand the history behind sort of where psychology is coming from. What are some of the roots of it? What are some of the structures that are sort of there that we aren't recognizing? So anyway, so yeah, it was really great to be there. I had some good feedback. I had people that said that, oh, I definitely want to buy your book. We'll see how many books actually got sold. But yeah, that was really good to see that, interest. I mean, I will say, if people are willing to go to a conference, they do get continuing education credit, so it's for anyone. But I think that people who are willing to go to a conference are at least open to more holistic understandings of mental health. And I say that because I think they're not the mainstream. And so I think that it's growing. I think that there's more and more. I think it's growing. I think more and more people are realizing, look, we need more than just the medical approach here. But I'm saying the fact that people are at the conference, I think, will make them be interested in my book, because they're already looking for more holistic. And I hope it'll be interest to anyone in psychology. But I'm just saying that I think that they're already sort of like, okay, I need some other perspectives here than just sort of my training in psychology. So, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think that covers everything I wanted to discuss for today, and this was amazing. It was everything I expected and more. So, thank you so much
Oh,
for agreeing to this, and hopefully we'll see you again.
well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here.